and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, at the heart of Malaysia's agri-food landscape lies a crucial yet vulnerable group, smallholders. Now, these individuals face mounting challenges in the face of climate change and also the growing need for sustainability practices in agri-food production, which may leave some smallholders vulnerable, particularly women smallholders being disproportionately impacted. So the latest report by Khazanah Research Institute draws from a comprehensive survey of 3,300 smallholders, and it sheds light on the pressing matters faced by agri-food smallholders in Malaysia, with a particular focus on climate risks, adoption of sustainability practices or certificates, and gender disparity. So joining me on the show to discuss this further, we have a couple of authors of the report, Dr. Teoh, Associate Research from KRI, as well as Syafiah Sharifulden, who is an Associate Research with KRI as well. Thank you so much for being on the show with me. Welcome. I appreciate your time. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Teoh. Maybe we can begin our conversation with you. Giving us kind of an overview as to why there was a need for this Project Semai, the big survey that I talked about of smallholders. What prompted it?
So some introduction about the report itself. So this is a report by Khazanah Research Institute. We look at 3,300 agri-food smallholder in Malaysia. So what we did is, these findings are actually derived from a survey called Project Semai, funded by Khazanah National Berhad, and conducted in collaboration with Khazanah Research Institute and also Think City. So KRI, our researcher at KRI, subsequently used the data and identified some of the key challenges that the agri-food smallholder in Malaysia are facing, and then we continue to investigate, understand what are these challenges, how are they affecting our agri-food smallholder, and how can we improve their livelihood and some other challenges for these significant portions of food producer in Malaysia.
Well, why is it important to look at smallholders? I mean, maybe I think a lot of people don't automatically know who agri-food smallholders are. Maybe you can share with us why look at agri-food smallholders.
Okay, I think firstly it is worth noting that this is actually the first nationwide survey in the nation. So involving smallholders. Before this, we do have surveys also, but it is mostly specific to a crop or a livestock, for example. So this is the first one, and we focus on smallholders because we find that they are the cornerstone of the food production of our country. So therefore, we wanted to focus on them because there are a lot of challenges that they're facing. They're also very, very vulnerable to agricultural challenges such as, like you mentioned, climate, and also they're also facing low yield and also high fertilizer prices. So they are facing all of these challenges, but they are being overlooked. So that is why we want to focus just on them for this survey, and that is how we came up with Project Semai, and that is also why we also delve into all of the areas like climate, sustainability,
So both of you authored two chapters, two respective chapters. You authored the Empowering Smallholders in Malaysia through MyGap, which is Malaysia Good Agriculture Practices certification. And Dr. Teoh, you wrote the chapter on gender gap among agri-food smallholders. And I'm quite keen to understand what you found because it's such a huge and comprehensive survey. So let's talk a little bit about maybe understanding the findings from your chapter first. What did you find, Dr. Teoh, in terms of women's roles in agriculture?
So agriculture is actually an interesting sector to look at when we want to investigate gender gaps, because historically, agriculture workforce, the overall agriculture workforce has been male-dominated. Female participations, the latest one was around 20%. So 1/5 of the workforce actually women, and the rest are men. So this raised a question whether is it because women are not participating, or perhaps prefer other sectors, Or is there a problem within this sector where we have gender gaps, whereby women are disproportionately affected or constrained by some factors that we do not know what specifically? So in our report, we look at this 3,300 of Agrifood smallholder. They consist of both men and women Agri-food smallholder in Malaysia, and we're looking at between Sabah, Sarawak, and also Peninsular Malaysia, because these are two different regions with different Agri-food smallholding landscape. So what we found in terms of the findings, I will summarize into 4 aspects. So we found gender disparity in 4 aspects. First is agricultural resources, specifically on agricultural machinery and equipment. We see that consistently women have a lower rate of agricultural machinery and equipment adoptions or possession as compared to their male counterparts. And this is in both Peninsula and also Sabah and Sarawak. Second is the contract farming participation. We also see women's smallholder have lower participation rate than their male counterparts, but more in Sabah and Sarawak, because in our sample of 3,300 smallholders, most of them who are contract farmers, they are mostly in Sabah and Sarawak. So we don't see that much of the difference in Peninsular Malaysia.
Okay.
So, and then number 3 is their training attendance or training experience, because training is critical for you to get knowledge, to expand your knowledge, to network, to obtain the necessary information to enhance your production efficiencies, and to get perhaps assistance from government organizations. And again, you see that women smallholder have lower training attendance than their male counterparts, specifically in Sabah and Sarawak. And lastly, on the sales-related matters, interestingly, we found that women smallholder tend to report difficulty in finding buyers for their farm outputs. For example, if they are vegetable smallholder or fruit smallholder, especially the regular buyers. On the other hand, men smallholder, they are less likely to report such difficulties, and it's because they have different buyers that they rely on. For example, men smallholder tend to engage wholesaler, women smallholder tend to engage the consumers directly.
Wow. Okay, can I just ask you, I mean, maybe this requires further research and further investigation, but why do we see such disparities? I mean, these are interesting findings to learn about the differences between men smallholders and women smallholders. First of all, the fact that a fifth are women, maybe historically agriculture is not, it's been a male-dominated field. But when we look at the differences in terms of machinery possession, for instance, could you maybe hazard an educated guess? Why do we keep seeing some of these gender disparities in agriculture?
So to begin with, Sabah, we had the differentiate between Sabah and Sarawak.
So you want to look at the differences, the regional. So maybe why are the gender disparities more apparent in Sabah and Sarawak?
First, this sample, if you look at between smallholder in the Peninsula and smallholder in Sabah and Sarawak, they are slightly different. Okay. For example, agri-food smallholder in Sabah and Sarawak, they are slightly older and they have more experience, longer years in farming, and they also have lower education level than those in the Peninsula. And interestingly, also see, which actually I shouldn't say interestingly because this is expected from national data, we see more women agri-food smallholder in Sabah and Sarawak as compared to Peninsular Malaysia. So in Sabah and Sarawak, about 1 in 5 smallholders are women. In Peninsula, it's about 10% of women smallholder only. Okay. So all these differences in the characteristics, social demographic characteristic, and the gender distribution of the agri-food smallholder between Sabah, Sarawak, and Peninsular Malaysia can explain why we see a different kind of gender disparity between these two regions, because gender gap itself is a very context-specific social issues.
That is great. I'm glad you pointed that out, because it's not, much like the fact that it is very context-specific. you also cannot solve it with kind of a blanket solution, right?
correct.
It has, the solution also has to be context specific. Okay, so so you pointed to the regional disparities. Is there anything else that you think underlies the gender gap?
So we also interesting to see that the gender disparity in Sabah Sarawak are quite consistent across several aspects. For example, training, agricultural machinery, contract farming, and also sales-related matters. And based on what we did not collect the data on poverty and food insecurity, but based on what we know from previous study that they were done in Malaysia on the local agri-food smallholder. In Malaysia, we can tell that Sabah and Sarawak have a different set of socio-economic constraints. For example, we know for a fact from national data that households who are headed by those who work in agriculture, whose main income is from agriculture productions, they tend to have lower income as compared to other sectors. Over half of them are earning about 44,000 ringgit, Malaysia and below. And in comparison, the national poverty line is around 2,589 ringgit. So that means for those who are working in agriculture, they tend to have lower income and therefore more likely to fall into the poverty. Yes, and in rural areas, agriculture tends to be the main economic activity. In Sabah and Sarawak, we have a higher proportion of rural populations, and also we have in Sabah and Sarawak there is quite a sizable workforce working in the agriculture, fishery and forestry. So this is why you can see this is tied to the socio-economic factors in that area. And this is socio-economic constraint. Second is the social-cultural factors. Because among the smallholder who we survey in Sabah and Sarawak, they are mostly orang asal. And their farming practices are very highly influenced by their social-cultural and other cultural practices that they are passed on from generations to generations.
Okay.
And this that we found from literature review that can also affect their, not just farming practices in general, but also between men and women. Okay. So these socio-economic and social-cultural factors together, they explain these gender disparities.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you and talk a little bit more about what targeted policy interventions might help address some of these gender disparities. I'm going to bring Anis into the conversation. Anis, I'm curious to know about the chapter you wrote. So let's talk a little bit about MyGap. I think we start by maybe understanding more about what MyGap is. Maybe you can tell us what the MyGap certification is and how important are sustainability standards to maybe solve some of the challenges that we see smallholders facing.
Right. So basically, MyGap is a sustainability certification whereby farmers will need to follow a certain set of requirements in order to get certified. So what's so interesting about MyGap is that the requirements that it covers is really broad, and it covers a lot of aspects. For example, environmental aspects, social aspects, food safety and quality aspects, animal welfare, and to some extent even economic aspects. So maybe I can just give a few examples to make it clearer. Yeah. Like for example, in terms of environmental aspects, right? MyGap really emphasized the less use of pesticide and also chemicals so that we can maintain our soil health. And then in terms of social aspects, MyGap also emphasizes the importance of having workers working in the farm trained, like safety training, hazard training, so that we can take care of their welfare, of their safety, of their health. And then MyGap also emphasizes on traceability across supply chain. So for example, if we were to have like an outbreak or something, right, on the consumer side, then MyGap would help in tracing where are the points of contamination, and so we can stop the contamination and to prevent any more damage that it will do across the supply chain. And then also I think a very important point on MyGap in terms of economic aspects is that it opens up a foreign market. Like for example, if we want to export our produce to Singapore, we would need MyGap certification. We can't get to Singapore market without MyGap. But the situation that we have currently is that those who are taking up MyGap are big players because of the compliance costs. So basically what this chapter, or my chapter, emphasizes is that this is a good program, but the adoption rate is very, very low, about 11% out of the total smallholders in Malaysia. So therefore, there is a need to actually make the adoption more widely.
Okay, can I ask you, did you find similar trends the way that Dr. Teoh found? So we saw regional disparities in the gender gap. We saw, orang asal maybe not, that perhaps maybe one of the reasons why their practices, their farming practices are such. Did you find any kind of similar findings?
Yeah. So basically what I find is that those in Sabah and Sarawak, they are less likely to adopt the certificate. So there could be various reasons to this. Perhaps one of the more general reason that we find is that they do not know the existence of MyGap. Basically, the government is not really pushing for this program to be made well known to these farmers, especially those residing in rural areas in Sabah and Sarawak. So therefore, we find that, okay, those in Sabah and Sarawak, they are less likely to have MyGap. And also we find that those with lower education level, they also tend to not really go for MyGap certification, perhaps because they don't really understand the benefit of it, and also they do not know how to apply. So yeah, those are, I think, one of the major findings I found in this chapter.
So you mentioned the kind of economic benefits of MyGap being able to access international markets. How does it stop local or small agri-food smallholders locally? I mean, does it create barriers? Is there a reason why that the adoption is so low, 11% as you mentioned, that they don't see the I guess the cons of it outweighing the pros of it?
Yes, so I think the major reason is basic compliance costs. So
is it expensive to get certified?
It is expensive to get certified because they would need money to train their workers, or they would need money to actually establish a proper storage system for their chemicals as per the MyGap requirements. So these are all additional costs that might not be affordable to our smallholders. So that is why perhaps they do not see the benefit of investing in all of these costs to outweigh the income or the extra income that they might be getting.
The benefit from being certified. So just paint a picture for me. Smallholders, how small are we talking about in comparison with some of the big players that you were mentioning, Anis?
So specifically in this report, we actually divided the smallholders into 3 subsectors, which are crops, livestock, and also aquaculture. So it depends on whether fruits, for example, less than 5 hectares, vegetables less than, I think, 2.5 hectares. For livestock, are smallholders with less than 25,000 chicken, for example. So it really varies, the term smallholders. So basically, we engage with the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security to get the proper definition of smallholders, which are included in this project. So
Okay, all right. So now I want to talk about so that was kind of what you found from the data of Project Samai. But now I want to talk about what we do with this, the findings of this data. How do we improve or address some of the challenges that agri-food smallholders face here in Malaysia? Anis, when you think about how you can encourage more smallholders to get MyGap certified, and you think about the compliance costs, and you think about the maybe more complicated approval process, what needs to be done to ensure that more smallholders are MyGap certified?
Okay. So I think in order to break the barriers of compliance costs, I think there should be some sort of financial assistance to them in terms of incentives or allowing for group certifications, whereby farmers can actually come together and they can be certified in a group instead of individually. And this has actually been done by individual state government, like Terengganu state government, and also Sabah has also done group certification, but it has not been done nationwide. So perhaps we can do more study on this to adopt all of this nationally. And also I think that since we have a specific group that are more left behind, like Sabah and Sarawak, perhaps a more targeted intervention program, like trainings or knowledge sharing. You know, just a simple knowledge sharing would be sufficient, because we want to get the concept of MyGap to them, because they do not know the existence of it. So we want to make them understand it first, and then whether or not they want to adopt it, then that should come later. But first is to bring this knowledge to them.
Right.
I think.
So they have all the information and they can make their
Yes,
the
yes,
decisions. Okay.
yes.
So you're hoping to see more targeted outreach.
Yes, definitely.
And kind of education and awareness
Yes.
about the benefits of MyGap and the application
Yes.
process. All right, let's talk a little bit about how we can create gender-responsive agriculture policies that will help reduce the huge gender gap that you found, Dr. Teoh. What policy recommendations will have come out from your research?
So one key takeaway from the findings in overall is that men and women agri-food smallholder, they have different outcomes, but they also have different farming practices and perhaps different preferences, for example, when it comes to their training needs and also the type of buyer they engage. So what we need is perhaps a more inclusive, gender responsive policy or approaches where we acknowledge that both men and women, they have different circumstances.
Can you give us an example of how, what those differences are? What did you find in terms of, say, training needs or marketing strategies?
So in terms of training needs, we found that more consistently in Sabah and Sarawak, where we see most of the gender disparity in our study, women smallholder they have a higher tendency to prefer training topics such as sales and marketing, and also financial management related training. So we do not know for sure because we didn't ask further question about why.
So it requires more research and more surveys.
Yes, it requires more research. But we also know from our findings is that they have different preferences. They have different set of challenges. For example, women smallholder tend to have difficulty finding buyers. And that's perhaps related to why they prefer sales and marketing related training as compared to their male counterparts. Their male counterparts, on the other hand, prefer trainings like new technology and new agricultural methods, and also sales and marketing, but to a lesser degree of interest as compared to their female counterparts. So that's one. For example, when it comes to the buyer that they engage, women smallholder tend to engage with consumer directly. They sell consumer to directly, and these consumers are usually the women buying food for their families in the local market.
So they prefer selling directly at the market and they're engaging with the customers one-on-one,
Yes.
whereas men prefer
wholesaler. So what we know, we can understand from previous literature, we also talked to an NGO who are very active in working with smallholders, not just agri-food, but also others type of smallholders and farmers on the ground, is that women sometimes prefer selling direct to consumer because they interact with them on a daily basis. They are also women buying food for their families, and they can sell a smaller quantities because we also found that women smallholder tend to reserve a portion of their the farm output for household utilization. Men smallholder, on the other hand, tend to sell all for income.
Do you worry that by relying on direct to consumer, who are irregular buyers, right? They don't buy set amount of quantities, as opposed to wholesale buyers who buy a certain set and is consistent. Could that disproportionately impact women to make them more vulnerable to any kind of financial impact or financial shocks?
So what we know from literature is that selling to consumer directly and selling to wholesaler directly, they have their own pros and cons. I would say it's hard to say which sales channel or which buyer is more beneficial or more superior over the other, but more importantly, we need to diversify your sales channels. And what we know from our findings, interestingly, is that our smallholder, regardless of gender, they tend to perceive wholesaler as regular buyers and consumer as irregular buyer, which makes sense because wholesaler tend to buy in bulk. And it's regular because you enter into a formal or informal agreement with the wholesaler. Consumer, on the other hand, relies on relationship building, verbal agreement, perhaps which are not formal. So perhaps in this case, women, we see that women tend to report difficulty in finding buyers. They also tend to rely on consumer. So perhaps what we need to do is perhaps help them to expand their sales opportunity, to let them know that beyond just selling the consumer, if you want more stability, perhaps diversify to more options such as wholesaler and
Could
retailer.
I ask you very quickly in the time that we have left, Dr. Teoh, what does gender-responsive agriculture policy look like? I mean, we now know there's a gap, but what does it look like in practice?
So gender-responsive policy is one that do not just acknowledge that there are gender differences, but also try actively address the factors that drive these differences. So what the policy recommendation that we derive from the finding is, first, when it comes to training, we need to tailor the timing, duration, location, and content of the training according to the practical needs and skill gaps of the smallholder. For example, between men and women smallholder. For women smallholder, group training in a more casual setting and shorter duration may be more desired, especially for those living in the rural areas. And second, when it comes to contract farming usually involves certain kind of support that they provide to the food producer. So instead of signing a contract, perhaps one step we can take before that is to assess the needs and the gaps of the smallholder and see what are the things that the contracting companies or parties can offer to support them, so that those who are constrained by socioeconomic reason can also participate, can given an opportunity to participate in contract farming, because contract farming can usually guarantee more stable flow of income and access to more extension services.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on the show and shedding light into this really important part of our food security mission for the country. And I appreciate you and the work that you're doing. Thank you for being on the show with me tonight. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.